I wanted to respond to Kennan's essay on transportation. I've liked this essay for a long time, but this essay is inadequate. Kennan does not understand where we are in the course of our history. He is too optimistic. He dreams of public policy that can last for decades in the United States. I don't know of public policy that can last for decades in the United States, and we're at a point now where we wonder just how much longer it will last. If the union will survive the next election cycle. That is a serious question at this point. Nevertheless, let's talk about policy and transportation. Now, I would first like to address the concerns of my libertarian friends and colleagues. I know that they don't like Kennan's point of view here at all, the idea that the government should pursue any policy in transportation. I'm assuming they would much prefer an anarcho-capitalist sort of solution. Just let entrepreneurs handle everything. Why should the government favor one over the other? I'm not ideological about this. I would say the libertarians are ideologists on this question, and I think that's unrealistic. Let's just look at the record. The record is that the United States has always had transportation policies. Kennan notes this in his essay. We can go back into the antebellum period and we can see that the federal government promotes and funds things like the improvements of ports and harbors. Even John C. Calhoun in the Monroe administration right after the War of 1812, John C. Calhoun is instrumental in supporting the construction of locks and river navigation aids, of port facilities. The idea of internal improvements is not something that's just exclusive to Henry Clay and the Whigs, though they do get a lot of what they want over time. Later on, the Republicans take over this policy, and that's one of the big Republican Party planks. So for better or for worse, and I'm very sympathetic to the libertarian argument that this was a very wasteful enterprise, both at a state level and a federal level. The governments in the United States did sponsor the building of railroads. Now, we can look at examples of privately financed railroads. I believe the most northerly transcontinental route, and I don't remember the name of that railroad, but it's the one that went from Chicago up into Minnesota and then over to Seattle. That one was privately financed. But of course, the most famous ones, the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific that built an original transcontinental railroad, got massive federal subsidies. This was very wasteful. This corrupted the federal government. There were lots of officials in the Grant administration, for instance, that got arrested for that, for getting kickbacks from railroads and financial corporations designed to support the railroads and to support the corruption of public officials. That was bad policy, but that was a fait accompli, right? That is part of a legacy. It was done. It was a bad idea, but now the federal government has invested in railroad infrastructure, and we do have railroad infrastructure. Like Kennan said, we had at one point the largest, best developed railroad system in the entire world. And it was thrown away. It was thrown away through choices in public policy, preferences in public policy. The government could have adopted a libertarian, laissez-faire attitude at that point in our history and allowed things to develop as they were. It could have divested itself of all interests in the railroads, for instance, and the railroads would have been able to compete with the motor car without government subsidies of roads. Now, this is the part of the story that we tend to overlook, we tend to take for granted. We don't particularly remember state governments, local governments, and the federal government itself investing massively in building paved roads in the United States. Now, which of us could imagine modern life without them? I'm not saying that it was a bad idea to pave roads, but when the government sponsored the massive subsidy to the tune of trillions of dollars invested in automobile infrastructure to facilitate the automobile into every nook and cranny of the United States, that was a public policy choice, and it favored the development of automobile infrastructure, and it disadvantaged the railroad infrastructure, the previously subsidized railroad infrastructure, to the point that huge amounts of it were wasted, were junked. Go into American towns these days and see the abandoned railroad stations. Now, whether those were built with private money or with public money, it was an incredible waste. And it was made, that waste was made with public policy choice to favor the automobile by building roads. Not every country did that. If we look at Europe, we can see examples of a mixed infrastructure. Now, Europe is very different because they have a much more concentrated urban population. Their cities are far closer together. We can make the geographical arguments there. America is very empty in comparison. There are vast distances that separate American cities. Perhaps the automobile is better for mainstream adoption in American life. But nevertheless, Europe had a more nuanced approach. They did build highways, but they kept the railroad infrastructure. All right, and you can still, there are plenty of Europeans that get along without cars. That's not the case in America. So my point is that we have a history with public policy on transportation. Allow me to sketch an example of a balanced American infrastructure. Now, we have many American models of a diversified infrastructure. And I have a particular example of a place that I know very well. I'm not going to name the place, but it's a place that I've studied extensively. I'm thinking of a small American city where the infrastructure was built by entrepreneurs, so there was not public money involved, but the city granted concessions to urban designers, to private enterprises that developed suburban neighborhoods around the urban core of the city. So public policy was nevertheless involved, even though the money was private. Okay? So what happened in this city was developers created an electrical infrastructure for neighborhoods in the city by building small hydroelectric dams and funneling the power into the neighborhoods they were developing with architects and land speculators. The way they distributed the electricity in the new suburbs that were being built was by building streetcar lines, electrical streetcar lines, through these master planned suburbs that had an architectural harmony as well as a diversity of architectural styles. There were small houses for those that are just starting out or had modest means. There were large houses for the upper middle class, for the wealthy of the city. But they were close together. They were all in walking distance with one another. And there was a streetcar line running through the middle of them that all the residents of the neighborhood could walk to, and they could take the streetcar to industry, places of employment. They didn't have to live beside the factory, right? The factory was a ways down the streetcar line. They could take the streetcar downtown where the train stations were. They could get transportation out of town. They could take the streetcar line downtown where the shops were. And the downtown area did not have to get dominated by parking lots at that point in the history. People didn't drive downtown, they just took the streetcar downtown. So, like Kennan said, the city maintained this concentrated core, even though, by all standards, this is a very small American city. The people that lived in these new suburbs were able to buy electricity that came off of the streetcar line. So the streetcar lines became public utilities. Now, we still have these things, they still exist today. Things like the company you buy electricity from. They're a public utility, which means that they're regulated by law. They have to go to a government committee when they want to change the rates that they charge for their services. Because the rate that they charge for your electricity or for your water, that's something that everyone in your area requires for their daily life. And so it's judged to be in the public interest that the rates are kept under control. The utilities are allowed to make a profit if they are public companies, but the idea is that there is a just profit to be made there and an unjust profit could be made there. So there's a regulatory control over it. Anyway, the story of the streetcar lines and the utilities in this particular town that I'm describing, it all came to an end during the New Deal. What happened during the New Deal was there was a public policy decision to increase the consumption of goods in the United States, specifically goods produced in American factories. And the Roosevelt administration offered a grant to this town that they could pave their roads. They could get federal grants to pave their roads on the condition that they paved over the streetcar lines. This necessitated the city to buy buses and establish a bus service. Now, the differences between the streetcar lines and the bus lines, perhaps they're known to you, perhaps you already have an opinion about that. I think that they are different. I much prefer the streetcar lines. Perhaps I'm just being quixotic, but that's my opinion. I'm not going into that here. It changed transportation in these cities. And it also had the effect of shutting down what was a private company in these towns. The streetcar lines were public utilities, but they were built with private investment and owned privately. They were regulated publicly. The city had a control over the amount of fare that streetcars could charge, for example. And of course, the streetcars were in conflict with the growing prevalence of automobiles on the road. And that was a point of tension. Nevertheless, they were shut down due to a public policy choice, just as they were incentivized by public policy choices. But that was the end of street railway in this particular town. Other towns have retained them, including my beloved New Orleans, which is kind of famous for its old streetcar lines. But now we get into my third point, and that is the dysfunction of modern cities. City governments, even outside of New Orleans, which has an infamously bad city government these days, city governments are very dysfunctional. City governments are corrupt. City governments are used to hand out sinecures and the spoils to the supporters of the city machine. There is a great deal of crime in urban centers. There is a real phenomenon of the flight of orderly people to the periphery of the cities, to the point where they will give up on all benefits of being in a city and go far outside the city limits. I don't see any of these cities cracking down on the crime that is prevalent in their public transportation, on the bus lines, for instance. City buses can be very scary. City buses are frequently filthy. You don't want to take your children on city buses. We all know of the instances of crime and outrages that have taken place on public transportation in American cities. We see videos of these things. We don't want to go onto these things. Um, I don't see city governments changing these things. Kennan is writing at a time where you could kind of overlook those things, perhaps. But now we don't overlook those things, and we ought to be realistic about them. Unfortunately, I think that it is the fate of most American cities to continue decline and to continue their path into further and further dysfunction and insolvency. I think that the public transportation that does exist is likely to continue to degrade and continue to be curtailed. Also, if we look at instances where there have been public transportation policies, these things are now so heavily regulated. The environmental impact studies, the handicap accessibility, uh, all the various requirements have made these systems impossibly expensive, ruinously expensive. There was a time I was enthusiastic about the California high speed rail project, which is now mostly defunct. I suppose they're going to build a high speed line in the San Fernando Valley where comparatively few people live. What are they going to connect Fresno and Bakersfield or something? What a ridiculous railroad line. It's supposed to connect San Francisco and Los Angeles. It's highly unlikely to do so in our lifetimes. And the cost overruns were stupendous. So the thing needed to be curtailed. What happened there? Dysfunctional government. Government that can't get things done. And impossible regulations. Another example of a public transportation project that was just recently completed was a light rail system in Honolulu, Hawaii. Now, aside from the fact that Hawaii has stupendous geographical difficulties, that materials are far more expensive in Hawaii because of its isolation, the cost of this project is stupendous. I remember a figure. It was costing $100 million per mile of completed rail, and the rail system does not even run through the urban center of Honolulu. So it does not service most of the people that might be inclined to use it. There's a plan to extend the line actually into the city, but considering the massive cost overruns and delays of the phase one of this line, it's unlikely to be extended into the city, it seems to me. Anyone with any sense would not allow these authorities to continue this boondoggle, waste more money on it. The thing was almost canceled when it was 90% complete because the overruns were so tremendous. Again, the story here is that the public authorities are so irresponsible, so corrupt. They are so disorganized and incompetent that they may not be trusted with these kinds of projects. They will only waste money and line their own pockets, and they will enrich the regulators, the bureaucrats that manage all the imponderable regulatory aspects of these things. Their own city and state bureaucracies. It's a business that serves only itself and cannot serve the public adequately. So I finally conclude that this kind of policymaking is in terminal decline. At least it's in decline as we know it, and there is no solution to be found here. But this is also an unsustainable situation. We don't want the cities to fall into ruin. We don't want them to become unlivable hellholes with no adequate transportation system. Transportation actually seems to be a very minor consideration at this point, considering all the other things going on in cities. Can you have a relatively safe neighborhood where you can raise your children? Can you have functional educational institutions? Right? These things aren't working in our cities. And those are obviously more important considerations. And so our cities continue to decline. We are not in a position to have functional public policy in transportation. That's my opinion. But it's also my opinion that we will have policy on transportation. I think that's the natural order of things. At least we will favor, like Kennan says, forms of transportation we find preferable. So when we come out of a period of decline and we have functional institutions that are trustworthy again, perhaps we can revisit the topic. But that may not be for us. I doubt it will be for us, unfortunately. Someday, when the bridges have fallen down, someday when the potholes will never be repaired, an entrepreneur will come into a neighborhood and make a deal with the property owners and people with responsibility and investment there, and make them an offering that he will restore the old streetcar line that used to run in the middle of the boulevard. He will dig out the old tracks. He will make them functional again. He will install some kind of jerry-rigged, repurposed railroad vehicle. He'll build a box around it to keep the people shaded from the sun and the rain. He'll call it Mr. Smith's Line. He will set up a little power station to move it around. And he'll sell the residents transportation and electricity. And they will give him a concession to run the line on the public land of the boulevard for 99 years. And that may be how this sort of thing comes back. I like the thought that making up a story about this sort of subject shows us that there is a mixture in this policy between public decisions for the common good. Neighborhoods need things like electricity and transportation. They need public utilities. And entrepreneurship. The private individual with competency, responsibility, know-how, and capital. The capital is an important element. They can come together and they can make our cities functional and also more beautiful. What's more beautiful than a boulevard with a streetcar on it, with comely houses nice to live in?